Chapter 6. Dusty Morgan was in a confused and bitter state of mind when he hit the ground at the end of the blanket rope from his hotel room. He crouched there in the shadowed dimness for a moment, listening to the loud muttering of men gathered in front of the hotel. They were cursing him, thirsting for his blood, and here he was, slipping away from them like any common criminal, cowering here in the darkness while two strangers held the angry men at bay upstairs. The thought of escape under these circumstances was revolting to him. It would be accepted as a sure admittance of guilt. If he did get away into Mexico, he'd be forever marked as a murderer, one who had shot an unarmed man in the back in a quarrel over the favors of a half-breed Mexican girl. For a moment as he crouched there, he was tempted to go boldly into the street and announce himself to the mob who clamored for him, if they'd give him a chance to explain. But quickly he realized they wouldn't. They were in a mood to shoot first and ask questions later. Pat Stevens was right, of course. Dead, he'd never prove his innocence. As long as he remained alive, there was always the chance that the truth about the shooting of the sheriff might become known. He gritted his teeth and turned away from the street, skulking cautiously along the side of a hotel at the rear exit of the alley. Keeping in the shadows as much as possible, he made his way around to a point near Joe Bain's livery stable on the road leading westward into the Big Bend. He could see the big El Paso San Antonio stage halted in front of the livery stable, and hostlers were bustling about changing the 12-horse team. In front of the big stage was a smaller one, with 6 horses harnessed and waiting. He knew that must be the Hermosa stage. He crouched by the side of the road and watched while men transferred baggage and supplies from the through stage to the smaller one. From that distance, he couldn't see very clearly, but it looked as though some passengers were being transferred. And then he saw the driver climb into his high seat in the front, and a moment later his whiplash cracked out over the backs of the leaders. The 6-horse team swung away sharply from the stable. Dusty Morgan began trotting forward to meet it, giving the impression that he was running towards town in an effort to intercept the vehicle. He timed his approach well, was seen by the driver before the stage had gained much speed, but after it was well away from the stable and any possibility of his being seen and recognized by any of the townspeople. The lead team snorted and swerved astride to avoid running him down. The driver tightened his lines and leaned down from the high seat to peer at the dismounted man as Dusty shouted, "Hey, stop the stage for me." The driver saw it on the lines and brought the 6 horses to a stop 20 feet ahead. Dusty panted alongside and leaned over the front wheel. "My horse gave out down the road a piece. Is this the stage to Hermosa?" "That's right. You got a ticket?" "No, I was just riding in to catch it. I got plenty of money, though." Dusty reached into his pocket. The driver glanced back over his shoulder at the stage depot a couple 100 yards back. A glint showed in his eyes and he grunted. "No use wasting time going back to buy a ticket. Give me the cash. The fare's $20. Dusty counted out $20 in gold and handed it up to the driver. He went back to the side door and jerked it open. There was a loud shout at the livery stable. Men began running towards the halted stage. With his cash fare in the driver's pocket, the driver was just as anxious to get away without having his passenger seen as was Dusty. He yelled at the leaders and cracked his whip just as Dusty stepped inside the dark interior of the vehicle. The resulting lurch sent Dusty sprawling onto the floor. The horses swung into a trot and then a wild gallop. Dusty got up off the floor and made his way back to the rear of the swaying coach. He pressed his face against the pane of dirty glass and looked back. But the moonlight was too dim to give a clear picture of what was going on. He had a confused impression of men gathering on horseback. It might well be a mounted posse formed to follow the stage. Someone might have seen the strips of blanket dangling from his hotel window, or Pat and Ezra might have let the secret of his escape out. He couldn't tell. At least, there would be some respite even if the posse was after him. The stage was rolling along at a high speed, and mounted men would have to push their horses hard to overtake it. Dusty turned back from the window and felt his way into the darkness to an empty seat. He couldn't see whether there was anyone else inside the dark coach or not. He got the makings from his pocket and mechanically began to roll a cigarette. He spilled some of the flake tobacco, but eventually fashioned a thin cylinder which stayed together. He struck a match and cupped it to his hands, putting flame to the tip of his cigarette. And as he drew in deeply, the little light flared up and briefly illuminating a face. A voice spoke hesitantly from the seat across from him. "You going to Hermosa too?" Dusty's fingers twitched and the match went out. He took a deep puff of smoke before replying. "Yeah, I dang near missed the stage back there." "You live around here?" The voice sounded young and eager, sort of strange and cityish, without the Texas drawl Dusty was accustomed to hearing. "Yeah, nearabouts," in a gruff tone to discourage any further question. But the other passenger was not easily discouraged. "My name is Ben Thurston," he told Dusty. "From Colorado. I've been riding stages for 5 days getting here." Dusty pulled on a cigarette and didn't say anything. He listened intently for some sound of pursuit from behind, but the rumbling noise made by the stage was so loud he couldn't hear a posse if it was coming. "I'm heading to Hermosa," said Ben Thirsty importantly. "Dodging the law?" Ben laughed, a sort of whining laugh. "Not me, but they do say there's a lot of outlaws here in the Big Bend. Is that so?" "I reckon." There was a short silence inside the stage, but the Colorado youth was avid for some conversation. "Are you acquainted with the KT Ranch on the border?" "Not personally. I've heard tell of the Katy, though." "There's a girl running it now, Katie Rollins. She was named after the ranch. Katie, see, for the brand, KT." Dusty had heard all about Katie Rollins and the big ranch she had inherited after her father's death, even as far away as the Pecos. He gave a non-committal grunt and dropped his cigarette butt to the floor and put it out with his toe. He wondered how long it would take a posse to overtake the stage rocking along behind galloping horses. "Her father and my father used to be partners," Ben Thurston was boasting. "Then they both got married and Dad moved to Colorado. We've got a ranch in Powder Valley that's almost as big as the KT, I bet." His reedy voice irritated Dusty. He thought the kid should shut up and leave him alone with his thoughts. He had plenty to think about, such as damning Rose's red lips. Why had he looked at them? If only he had known she was the sheriff's girl, but no one had told him. And he didn't know much about girls like that. Nor much about girls of any kind, he reminded himself with disgust. "I guess Katie Rollins has been having a lot of trouble running the ranch since her father died," Ben broke in on his bitter thoughts. "It's too big of a job for a girl. She needs a man around to run things. Girls are only fit to get married and run a house. Don't you think so?" Dusty agreed with a short, "I reckon." "That's why I'm here," Ben explained eagerly, "to take hold of things on the Katy." Dusty dragged his thoughts away from what was happening in Marfa. Just as well talk to the passenger from Colorado, he figured. It might take his mind off his own troubles. "How come?" And then he settled back and rolled another cigarette. "She wrote a letter to me asking me to come and help her. That is, she wrote the letter to my father. Before he died, her father made her a promise to call on Dad if she ever needed help. Well, I guess she must need it pretty bad. She didn't say why in her letter, but she sounded pretty desperate. So I got on the stage and I just started out. She's been expecting me," he added.
Dusty Morgan replied, "Sounds right interesting."
"Dad, he thinks maybe it's rustlers. He says the Big Ben's full of them. I got his old 6-gun with me in case it's something like that."
"You pretty good with a gun?"
"Well, I haven't had much practice," Ben Thurston admitted. "But I guess I'd do all right if I had to. I've heard that most of these so-called bad men are probably really cowards when it comes to a gunfight."
"Oh, that's so." Dusty held his cigarette rolled. He lit a match and looked at his companion in the opposite seat in the tiny light. He saw a young, peaked face under the brim of a white Panama hat, a striped shirt and tie, and a city coat. He lit his cigarette and blew the match out. The coach was still rolling along at a fast clip, and there was no sign of a pursuing posse as of yet.
"If Rollins' girl's as pretty as her picture, I might even decide to marry her and stay here and run the ranch," Ben told him.
"She's pretty, huh?"
"Her picture is, and she sent it in her letter. I've got it right here. I'll show it to you if you want to hold another match."
Dusty didn't particularly care to look at a girl's picture right then. He had had his fill of girls back in Marfa, but he got out a match and struck it, leaning sideways to look at the picture Ben Thurston held out for him. His fingers shook as he looked at Katie's likeness. It was like her eyes were looking right at him, begging him to help her. Like her lips were parted to speak to him, and he knew right away that she wasn't the kind of girl to call for help unless she needed it bad. He darted another look at Ben Thurston as the match flickered out and felt sorry for Katie Rollins. She was sure due to be bad disappointed when she saw what her letter had brought to the Big Ben from Colorado. Of course, there hadn't been any way for her to know what the son of her daddy's old partner would be like. Ben asked eagerly,
"Wouldn't you marry a pretty girl like that if you had the chance?"
"What makes you think she'll have you?" Ben laughed.
"Well, I guess she will, all right. It was sort of a joke when we was little. Between our fathers, they always said we'd get married when we grew up. I guess maybe she's been wondering why I didn't come and see her. Maybe that's the real reason why she wrote the letter, not because of any trouble at all. You know how girls are, sometimes not wanting to come right out and ask a fella."
Dusty was conscious of an intense feeling of dislike for his coach companion. He asked, "Has she seen a picture of you?"
"No, not since I was 5 years old. She'll be surprised all right when she sees me tomorrow morning."
"Yeah, I reckon she will." It made Dusty sort of sick to think about a girl waiting eagerly and hopeful for a man to come help her, and then drawing something like that of Ben Thurston. It was a downright shame. But she was a girl after all, the same sex as Rosa, and he was a damn fool to be feeling sorry for her. She probably wasn't any better than Rosa, writing letters to a man she'd never seen. But he knew in his heart that she was different from Rosa. No girl could look like the one in the picture without being pretty much all right. He'd bet she was on the square. If he wasn't riding for the border with a posse behind him, by God, he might stop in at Hermosa himself and just see what kind of fix she was in. Perhaps if she needed a gun hand. But it wasn't any good thinking about that. He couldn't stop this side of Rio Grande. No decent girl like Katie Rollins would ever look at him again. One mistake in Marfa had ended all that for him. Forever. By running away like this, he was practically admitting his guilt. He began to wish he had stayed behind. No matter what Pat Stevens said, there was something worse than just dying. Looking into Katie's eyes had made him realize that. If he had ever known a girl like Katie, he had never been attracted by the likes of Rosa. But there wasn't any use going over back things again. What was done was done. He was a fugitive riding for his life, and hopeful-eyed Katie Rollins was waiting at Hermosa for a dude from Colorado to come and help her out of trouble. Dusty grimaced and swallowed down a bad taste in his mouth, and then rolled another cigarette. Ben Thurston remained silent. He began to snore softly after a time. The stagecoach rocked along behind galloping horses, and still no sound of pursuit. After a time, Dusty nodded, and then also slept. He slept fitfully in the bouncing coach, half rousing now and then to listen for the sound of horse beats behind them, dozing off again after convincing himself that there was no immediate danger. He came awake suddenly with the sound of a revolver shots ringing in his ears. He heard a hoarse shout of alarm from the driver and then his gun answering the shots. Dusty came out of his seat with his gun in hand. He figured that the posse had cut around in front to stop the coach, but he wondered why they were firing on the driver and why the driver was responding. The driver stopped shooting suddenly, and the coach lurched forward at a mad pace. Ben Thurston awoke and cried out excitedly, "What is it? What's happening?" "A hold-up, I reckon, and they got the driver. The horses, they're running wild." Two more shots sounded into the night, and there was a shrill scream of agony from one of the horses. The coach tilted up precariously with one wheel on a rock, and then overturned and began grinding and sliding down a steep hillside. Tangled in their harness, the 6 horses were carried along, kicking and struggling to get free. Dusty gripped a seat and remained crouched on the floor until the overturned coach reached the bottom of the hill. Ben Thurston began fighting his way towards the double doors, which were now overhead, whimpering, "We'll get killed. We gotta get out." "Wait," Dusty said sharply. "Don't open that door. They'll be waiting outside." A bullet crashed through the floor of the coach beside him as he spoke. He fired back, and a heavy voice shouted, "Come out through the door with your hands up, and maybe you won't get hurt. We only want one of you." "Guess he's talking about me," Dusty said quietly. "Let me go." But Ben was fighting for the door latch, tearing at it with his fingernails. He thrust open one of the doors while Dusty was groping his way towards him, pushing his head and shoulders through the aperture, and shouted, "I'm coming out. I'm Ben Thurston from Colorado, and—" A revolver shot cut him short, the bullet smashing his words back into his mouth. As he sagged back to the floor, another bullet crashed through the top of his head, lifting the upper part neatly away. Dusty lunged forward to catch him, pushing his body aside, and peered over the edge of the door with his gun balanced in front of him. In the grim grayness of pre-dawn, he saw 2 mounted figures galloping away down a narrow draw into which the stage had toppled. He emptied the gun after the killers, but it was too far away for accurate shooting, and in a moment they were gone. Dead silence blanketed the scene, broken only by the frenzied breathing of trapped horses and their efforts to escape from the tangled harness. Dusty stood there a moment, staring somberly after the fleeing men. They certainly weren't members of the posse, but they didn't act like hold-up men either. It didn't make any sense. Killing the driver and wrecking the stage, and then galloping off without any bounty. He broke his gun mechanically and then reloaded it from one of his belts and then slid it back into his holster. He was in a hell of a fix now, sure enough. trapped here in the wrecked stage and with the posse likely to sweep up any minute. It'd be daylight soon, and they'd be tracking him down sure enough if he tried to get away and reach the border. End of chapter 6.